Hello, I'm Richard London. I'm a GP by background and I also work for NHS Improving Quality. Welcome to this module on demand and capacity. The module comprises of 3 short presentations. In the first presentation, we'll be looking at what we mean by the terms demand and capacity and how queues form. In the second presentation, we'll be looking at how we manage our queues and how this can actually make matters worse. In the final presentation, we'll be looking at some of the principles for dealing with the underlying problems which cause us our demand and capacity issues. So what do we understand by the terms demand and capacity, and why is it so important, not only in primary care but also secondary care and the whole health economy? And what are its possible causes? We've become used to waiting in the National Health Service. We've become used to queues, waiting lists and delays. This obviously affects both the patient and the staff experience. It also has a direct effect on patient quality and patient safety, as we all know that the patient's clinical condition can worsen as they wait. We're continually informed that demand is rising and that more capacity is required. More doctors, more nurses, more kit, more beds. But is this always correct? So why do queues form? And do we actually understand what the terms demand and capacity really mean? And do we fundamentally understand what the demand on our service is? What is clear is that we need to gain a better understanding of the problem before we attempt to solve it. So let's look at some of the basic terms involved. And I think it's often easier to think of this in terms of rivers and lakes. Into our system flows the river of demand. And the demand is essentially all the requests for a service from all sources. It's what we should be doing. This demand flows into a lake. This lake becomes our waiting list, our queue. And our waiting list is what we should have done. And often the water stays in there a very long time. Out of this lake flows another river, and this is the river of capacity. Capacity is what we could do, all things being equal, if we were to fully utilise our staff and all our equipment to its full effectiveness, then that would be our capacity. So our capacity is what we could do. However, all processes have a bottleneck or a rate limiting step, and what actually flows out of the river is our activity, which is what we actually did. Now, of course, our activity is what we generally measure. We're measuring what we are doing. And of course, within that waiting list sits the patient, and the patient experiences delay. So to summarise, demand is what we should be doing, capacity is what we could be doing, activity is what we actually are doing, and our backlog or waiting list or queue is what we should have done. The two that we tend to measure out of these 4 are our activity, what we're actually doing, and our backlog or queue, which is work that we should have done. However, the one that we really should be measuring is our demand. In order to understand the system and understand some of the underlying issues, we need to have an accurate measurement and an accurate understanding of our demand. So why do queues form? The usual theory is that for a queue to form, demand must exceed capacity. But is it more to do with a mismatch between demand and capacity? Or do we like to have queues because they make us feel busy, better utilised? After all, if capacity is not fully utilised, it is often deemed to be waste and may therefore be taken away from us. So if demand is truly greater than our capacity, then the queue will continually increase. If the demand is greater than the capacity, our waits will get longer and longer. But is there evidence for this? Are our queues really getting longer and longer? When we go away and measure our waiting lists and our wait, what we find is that most of our waiting lists are actually fairly constant. They are not rising. So it appears that in most instances, demand is not greater than capacity. Now we know that our demand is not constant. It varies. It varies by time, so by day of the week, by hour of the day. It varies by demographics, by age, by sex, by ethnicity, and it also varies by condition and in many other ways. But also our capacity varies. It varies by time, by people, by our members of staff, and also by kit. Staff take holidays, take half days, take study leave, and our equipment may be down for repair or being serviced. And it's actually this variation and the mismatch between the demand and capacity that generates the queue. So the real moment of truth here is that even if the average capacity equals the average demand, then the variation in the two will cause a queue. Furthermore, if we measure our demand and our capacity, then we discover that it's capacity that generally varies more through holidays, study leaves, half days, etc. And as the capacity is mainly under our control, are our queues and waiting lists due to the way we run our services? Are we actually generating our own queues? And this is a really fundamental question. And if we're generating our own queues by the way we manage our system, why do we talk so much about demand management? In the second presentation, we'll look at how we manage our queues and our waiting lists, and how this often makes the situation worse.